So what we're going to start doing now is actually using P5 to draw some stuff, some basic shapes. And so that's one of the things that P5 does for us. It makes it easy to draw shapes. If this was like a computer science graphics class, we would be talking about like line drawing algorithms. Like we'd actually have to teach the computer how to draw a line, which is actually pretty fun and interesting, but not what we're going to do in this class. P5 just does this for us, so that's kind of nice. But we're going to use some shapes, and for now, we're just going to create a character for our game. And so you can make something that looks like the character that you used in your Scratch game, or you can make something completely new. The main goal is just to kind of get used to using the shape functions and understanding how computer graphics actually work from a sort of more basic point of view. So I'm actually going to make a new sketch here. So I'm going to save this sketch, and then I want to make sure to add it to the collection that I just created, which it already is. So I'll just leave that. So I'm going to click File, New. And one of the things you'll notice is when you create a new P5 sketch, it has these two built-in functions for you, Setup and Draw. So I'm going to quickly talk about what those do, and then we'll add some drawing functions. So I'm just going to call this P5 Shapes. And normally what I do is I just go ahead and put in a comment at the top. So I do a little multi-line comment like that. This part you don't have to follow along, by the way. If you want to follow along, you can. But I'm going to share this with you guys when I'm done. This is just going to be kind of a starter template. This is my P5 Shapes example by Owen, and this is the 28th. So usually I'll have a little starter comment like this. It's pretty straightforward. We don't really need that much more information, but we'll use it for other things in the future. Okay, so I'm going to put a couple notes here so we know what these functions do. So setup, it runs once before the program starts drawing. Okay, so setup, anything that's in the setup function only happens once. And it sets up our drawing environment before we actually start drawing stuff with code. If I draw something in here, well, actually, let's do that in a second. Draw runs 60 frames per second. So about 60 frames per second. So draw is constantly drawing our graphics. So it's constantly drawing and updating our graphics. Okay, so setup, again, it happens once. So one thing that it does is it creates our canvas. We'll go over this in a second. Draw is always running as long as the program's running, and that's what makes things like move and change. If you guys remember from MMP 100, you probably learned about animation. In that you learned about the persistence of vision, how when in animation, we take a series of images of an object moving, and that creates the sense of motion. That's the same thing that happens in all computer graphics. So the mouse moving across the screen, games, characters moving around, all of that is based on the same idea. We're drawing an image, but we're doing it so fast that when we change the position of the mouse, it looks like the mouse is moving. So that's what's happening in our draw function. Okay, so when I run the program, the first thing that happens is setup. And that's what does this thing called create canvas. That's what makes this like gray box that we're gonna draw on. So the canvas is where we draw our graphics. You can see these two numbers here, 400 and 400. You probably could guess what those do. Does anybody have a guess of what those do and what would happen if I change them? It changes the size of the canvas. So the first number is going to change the width of the canvas. So if I change this to like 600, it gets wider. I'm hitting enter, command enter, by the way, which is why I don't have to reach over to the play button. Okay, if I change the height to 200, it gets shorter. This is usually how we talk about graphics. We have the width and then the height, or the X and then the Y. So the X usually describes the X or width. I'm drawing at an angle. Let me line up a little bit better here. So this is our width, and we also call this the X. The X axis is horizontal, and then this dimension here is the height, or we describe it with the y-axis. Okay, so we're gonna leave it at 400, and then create canvas. You notice the camel case there. Canvas is capitalized because there's two words. Create just actually creates that element on the web page. If we inspect this, we can see that this is just a plain old HTML element right there, the canvas. It just has a special property, which is that it can draw graphics. We can draw any graphics that we want on this canvas. Okay, so that's set up. It only happens once. So for example, if I say console.log and I say 1 here, you're gonna see 1 in the console, and it just happens once. Whereas down here in draw, if I say console.log 2, and I run this, you're gonna see this number right here. This is counting how many times I've logged 2. So it's counting, constantly. That number is going up really fast. Okay. So in our draw function, we draw graphics. You can see there's already one function that's written in here called background, which draws the background. Does anybody have a guess of what this number means, this 220? For the color, yeah. That's exactly what it is. So the number that goes in the background is the color of the background. If it's 0, it's black. So it uses 0 to 255 as the number range to describe colors. If there's just one number, it's grayscale. So 0 is black, 255 is white. And numbers in the middle, like 220 is the default, are gray. If it's like 100, it's gonna be a darker gray. So we can just use a number there. I'm gonna talk more about color in the next lesson, but for now we're just gonna focus on shape. Okay, so in P5, so let's talk about shapes. So we have different shapes that we can draw. We're gonna start with some primitive shapes. We can get very complex with our shapes. If we look at the reference, there's a whole section on shape, and you can see 2D primitives. These are basic shapes. All of the graphics on our computer are, at the end of the day, basic shapes, but there's different ways to draw them and make them more complex. So we have the 2D primitives. We also have curves and vertex, so we can make more complex shapes with curves and vertex. I encourage you to explore those. I'm not gonna cover those, but you can check those out. We're gonna start with just some 2D primitives, and we're gonna try to recreate a simple character using just the 2D primitives. One thing that we're gonna go over is the difference between the different types of shapes. And this has to do with how we draw them on the canvas. We'll start with a simple square. So we have rectangle or square. These are pretty much the same thing. A rectangle is like a square. Obviously, the difference is that the width and the height are not the same. So a square, draws a square like that. It takes a few parameters. If we look down, all of our functions have parameters or arguments like we looked at with our example function. And the order of the arguments is important. So the order of the numbers that we use determines how the square is gonna look. So the first number is the X position of the square. Then we have the Y position of the square. And then S stands for size. And then there's a bunch of optional parameters. So if you look at the reference and you see these square brackets around a parameter, that means it's optional. That means if you don't put it in, it'll still draw a square, but it'll use a default number. So we'll look at those in a second. Okay, So square and circle, the way that those shapes work is that they have an origin point and then they have a size. So what that means is that in our graphics, we have our x axis that goes like this, and we have our y axis that goes like this. And then across our canvas, we have a point for every single intersection on the x and y axis. So this point right here is 0, 0. X is 0, y is 0. This point down here is 400, 400. So x is 400 and y is 400. And then we have every possible point in between. When we draw a rectangle, we're going to put a point on the canvas, and then we're going to draw a rectangle like that, or a square. So we start with a point, and then we draw like that. And then we're actually going to adjust that, but for now, that's how we're going to do it. So if I want to draw a square, I'm going to start with an X. That's the number where the square starts on the horizontal axis. So for this example, I'm just going to use 200, just a nice round number. And then I'm going to use the same thing for our y-axis. And then I'm going to use a smaller number for our size. I'm going to use 40, just a nice round number. Okay, so we get this nice little square. Really, really basic. We're not going to talk about the color yet, but we are going to change the color later in class, so don't worry about the default color for now. So just like our canvas and our background, if we change those numbers, we get a different outcome with the square. So if I change the first x parameter to 0, we go all the way back to the beginning of the canvas. If I change it to 400, it's going to be on the other side of the canvas, so we don't even see it. It's off the canvas. Same thing with our y. One thing to notice about the y is it may be a little counterintuitive. Y starts at 0 at the top, and it gets bigger as we go down. So if I change the y value of our square to 0, we see it at the top of the canvas. If I change it to 300, it goes down the canvas. So that might be a little counterintuitive, but in P5 and in a lot of cases with our computer graphics, that's how y is oriented. Okay, so again with our square, as I mentioned, when we draw a square, we have an xy to start here, and then we just have a size. So this 40 is the same height and width. If we draw a rectangle, we can have a different height and width. I mentioned those optional parameters. If I put in another number at the end here, like let's put a 10, that's going to add a little bit of roundedness to the corners. It's not necessary, but it's kind of nice. You can get kind of a softer square that way. You might want to, design an icon or something like that, so that might be useful. So our square is going to have an origin point, and then it's going to have a shape, a size. We can actually change the origin point. So when we're drawing a character for a video game, a lot of the time we want the character to be centered around a point. That makes it easier to detect where the character is. So let's imagine we have a character that looks like this, and we've got, our bird character coming down like this. In Scratch actually does the work for us of telling us if the bird and the character are touching. But when we use P5, we're going to have to do that ourselves. We're going to have to figure out how to program that. So it's easier if we have the square coming from the center and the bird coming from the center. It's easier to do the math that way. Sort of depending on how you do it, but I think we'll find it's easier. So one thing I can do is I can change something called the rect mode. So there's also these functions that change the way graphics work. And if I want to change the rect mode, I can change it to center. This center is all caps. It looks a little weird, but the reason it's all caps is because it's a constant value. It never changes. So when we have values that change, like our numbers, we just use regular variable names. When we have numbers that don't change, we use all caps to signify this is always the same. So if we change this to rect mode center, now our rectangle draws from a different place, which is the center, which is going to be more useful for us, but it's not always more useful. So now that's the center, and then our rectangle draws around it. Okay. Let's add another couple of shapes. So besides squares, we can draw circles. I'm going to put this back in the middle of the canvas. So I can draw a circle. And to start, I'm just going to draw a circle in the same place as the rectangle. So I'm going to do 200, 200, X and Y. And let's make it a little smaller. I'm going to make it like 10. Okay, so now we've got a little circle. All right, so we're starting to get somewhere. We can put circles and squares together. And I'm going to move this circle over a little bit so that I can make a couple eyes for my character. So I'm actually going to put some comments here. I'm going to say this is the face, and here are the eyes, just so I know what I'm doing. And one of the nice things about using P5 with code is what you might think I have to do now is come up with a different number. But what I can actually do that's a little bit easier is just use some math. So I know that my rectangle starts at 200, 200 right here. And I know that I want my eye to be like over here a little bit. So I'm just going to draw it bigger just for an example. So what I want to do is I want to move it that way, right? And so I know that on X, going this way is negative. And that's actually the same thing on Y. If I go this way on Y, it's also negative. Because 0, 0, XY is up here, and 400, 400 is down here. Okay, so instead of coming up with a new number, I can just do some math. I can say minus 10. Okay, there we go. So we moved our I over. So inside of my parameters, if I stay with it before the little comma, I can use math. I can use basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. So it makes it a little bit easier to do that math. So let's do the same thing on the y-axis. I'm going to do minus 10. And there we go. Now I have an I. So yeah, as we add in our parameters, as long as we are careful and we always have the commas, so the commas separate the different parameters. We can just do basic math in here rather than what I would have had to do is say like, okay, this is 190. That's not very hard math, but it's a lot easier to say what's this number that I already wrote minus this number so I can move over. Okay, so let's put in our other I. So for this, I'm just going to copy this code here and just paste it in like that. So now I can say, instead of minus, let's do plus. Okay, so now we've got our other I. So that was pretty easy. I had one going to the left. I want the other one going to the right. If I wanted it to go down for some reason, I could, change this into a plus. Maybe if I was making like a dice, that would be useful, but I want them to be on the same level. So I'm gonna stick with minus. Okay, so both squares and circles and rectangles, and then the rectangle version of a circle is called an ellipse. So square, rectangle, circle, ellipse. All of these are the type of shape where there's a point, an XY point, and then a size around that point. The other way that we can draw shapes is just points. So some shapes just have points. You can imagine, so with a circle, it's easy to imagine there's a point and then there's a circle around that point, or there's a point and there's a square around that point. But some shapes are more complicated than that. So like a line is just 2 points that are connected, and we may want to draw lines. And then triangles are 3 points that are connected. Okay, so there's not an easy way to describe a size or a point. So we just use points. So we have point plus size for our circles and squares. And then we have just points for some of our other shapes. And then our more complex shapes like the curves and the vertexes, when we add a bunch of points together, those also just use points. So let's do a line. I'm gonna do a little mouth for my character using a line. So to draw a line, this one is a little bit harder. I use line. That part is easy. Obviously it makes sense, it's a line. But then I have 4 different numbers for the line. So if I have a point here and a point here, I have the X here and the X here. So where it is on the X axis, here and here. And then I also have a Y, where it is on the Y axis for both of these points. So we call that x1, y1, and x2, y2. And we put them in order like that. X is always paired with y. So to draw my line, I'm going to try to put it in the character. So I'm going to start with like 200. I'm just actually going to start with the actual the point. You can notice there's a teeny little point in there. You might not be able to see it on the projector, but I'm not drawing a very big line because it's 1 point. But now I can use some math to design it. So this is my first xy. It actually doesn't matter the order because it's just drawing a line between the two. So let's see if I say like -5 on x, and then maybe -5 on y. We're moving that point down a little bit. Actually, let's try +5. Okay, and then maybe I'll try +10 and +10. Okay, that's moving it over there, but now it's kind of offset. Let's try maybe -10. Okay, that's kind of funny. So we've got kind of a funny line there. So I've got -10 and +5 here, and then +10, +10 over here. And maybe I can make like a cross. I can copy this line, and if I want to cross them over, I'll just, no, that, I can just maybe minus these guys. No, I have to be a little more clever than that. Okay, let's see if we can figure this out. So here's my shape, and the line looks like that. So I've got -10 +5 over here, and I've got +10 +10 over here. So if I want something to line up, then I need to keep the +10 on y. So that's going to stay the same. But I want this to go down. Yeah, so that's the +10 on y. And then x actually stays the same. Okay, so I just need to change this y value to +10 instead of +5. Okay, maybe I need to go... Oh, you know what? I need to go the opposite direction over here. Okay, there we go. That's kind of cool. I don't know. You can kind of play around with it, get something that you like. You don't have to obviously use exactly how this looks. But I've got a little cross here. Actually, maybe I want to make it a little smaller, more centered. So maybe I'll change all of these to 5. Okay, that's kind of cute. Okay, so those are some lines. So the line looks a little bit crazier because we've got a bunch of parts. You may want to add these together if you don't like the pluses, or you can just create your numbers. However you want to do it is fine. Okay, I'm going to add some ears, and then I'll pause for a bit. All right, so the triangles are going to be the hardest one that we're going to cover today because there's 3 points, so there's 6 total numbers. So when we draw a triangle, I'm going to try drawing like ears like that. So a triangle has x1, y1 up here. It has x2, y2 here, and then x3, y3 here. So we need 3 different points. The order doesn't really matter again because it's a triangle, so you can't get crossed over like you can with a square. But we're just going to draw those. So let's draw the ears. So I'll draw a triangle. And again, I'm going to do a similar thing. I'm just going to start out where I know where the point is. It's easier to start out with something that I know what it is and then move from there. So I'm going to start with 200, 200, 200, 200, 200, 200. Okay. 1, 2, that's x1, y1. 3, 4, that's x2, y2. And then 5, 6 is x3, y3. So the triangle is a little bit trickier. You don't have to use triangles, but if you want to use them, you can. So you can see the little dot here, but this isn't what we want. So let's start moving 1 point, and we're gonna move similar direction to our eye. We're gonna move in this direction. So we're gonna go -x and -y. So let's say x -10 to start, and y -10. Okay, so that's pretty good, but I want it to go farther. Let's do x -20, y -20. Okay, I want to go even farther on y. That's pretty good, y minus 30. You can see this line is starting to get a little long. So if you want, you can actually break up your lines. JavaScript doesn't really care if you have a bunch of different lines. So you can break up your lines like this and it'll still work. I can even put a little comment here that says point or x1 comma y1. Okay, so then we just need to move this guy over here. So we really just need to move the x over. So let's say x minus 20. Okay, now we've got our triangle. That looks pretty good. So this is x2, y2, and x3, y3. Okay, and then I actually want this behind the face. So I'm just gonna grab this. So I'm gonna select the whole thing with the mouse and hit Command X to cut. And then I'm gonna go up here and put it there. So if I want a shape to be behind another shape, it has to come first in the code. So the code draws each shape one after the other. So if you want the face layered on top, the triangle, that ear has to come first. Okay, so let's add the other ear. I'm just gonna copy this whole thing and I'm just gonna flip the X's because I just wanna go in the other direction, but the Y's are gonna stay the same. So the Y's are gonna stay the same, the ear's still gonna be like that. Hey. The X's are what's gonna change because instead of drawing over here, I wanna draw over here. Okay, so let's just add 20 on X. All right, now I've got my ears. Okay, that's pretty good. I'm gonna stop here. I might add some more to this, but I just wanted to cover the basic shapes. So I'll stop here, but what I'm also gonna do, I'm gonna save this, but then I'm gonna make a template for you guys to get started. So I'm gonna save this as P5 shapes. And I'll call this my character. And I'll add this to our collection. But then I'm going to make a copy of this. So I'm going to put a link to this on the class page that you guys can get started with. I'm not actually really adding that much here, but I'm going to duplicate this. And I'm just going to delete the shapes that I wrote. So you guys can start with your own shapes. And I'll just put a note that says, draw your character here. And so the character just has to go in between the two draw brackets, but other than that, you can just add whatever shapes you need to add. So I'll save this as shapes template. And I'll put a link to this on the class page. Let me put this in our collection first. Oh, it already is. Oh, wait, did I delete? Crap, I think I didn't. I thought I duplicated it, but maybe I didn't. Anyway, I can redraw it in a second. Okay. Okay, that's fine. I'll have to redraw it. Anyway, I'm gonna put the link in the schedule. And I'll put it on the YouTube video as well. Okay. There we go. Okay, so we're gonna take a break. I'm gonna go over color in a little bit. We're sort of running on a weird schedule today, but that's okay. But for now, just take that shapes template and just start trying to recreate your character. If you want to start with a new character, that's fine too. But since we're starting with really basic shapes, it might be easier to have something that you want to recreate. And it doesn't have to be perfect, you know, just make something that kind of looks like a character that you could use in the game. This is just kind of practice to get used to writing the code. But just start with shapes, and then we'll add color later.